Welcome to Lean Into Leadership, where we lead the conversation about anything and everything leadership related. On today's episode, Audrey Elworth joins the show. Everyone, welcome to episode 14 of Lean Into Leadership. Brandon Scow is your host here, joined by Audrey. Thanks for being here. We're super pumped to get this going. A little bit about you, Audrey. Currently serves as the Assistant Director for Residential Education at CMU. Also has previously served as a Resident Hall Director. And before that, you did some teaching and was also the Residence Life Coordinator at Jacksonville State. And then also, too, you did some work in the Leadership Institute when you were a grad student. Here, you do your assistantship. Previously, LeaderShape, co-lead facilitator. Yep. Congrats. It's awesome.
Yeah,
it's going to be a
you.
really good time. And then also, too, you're working on your doctorate right now. And so I think Audrey's passion for lifelong learning, student development, and leadership shows up in all your interactions. I'm super pumped to jump into a little bit more today. Yeah. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and, just talk about leadership and all that good stuff.
Let's do it.
All
Awesome.
right.
All right, we're going to jump right into it. So first question is, how do you personally define empathy?
Yeah, empathy, it's so important. And I think a lot of people confuse empathy and sympathy, which there's a great Brene Brown video. If you haven't watched it, it's cute. It's like 3 minutes long. It's animated, and it kind of defines the difference, because I think for a lot of us, we think empathy is saying things like, I'm sorry that happened to you, or that sucks, right? And it's really more so, I might not understand exactly what you're going through, but I'm here for you. And trying to connect, because you're never going to have the same experience as someone else. Even if you're going through the same thing, you are not them. And so for me, empathy is trying your best to connect with someone and just support them, even if you aren't experiencing it yourself.
Awesome. Hopping into that, why is empathy so important to building relationships and functioning teams or building teams?
Yeah, I think empathy is the cornerstone of trust when you think about your teams. I mean, if you try to walk in, start day one and say, all right, we're going to be a team, we're going to work together, here's our goals and outcomes, but then you never take the time to check in on each other, or you don't, make sure your team is okay on that human level, then you're not going to feel as connected. And you don't have to have, the deepest personal connection with your team all of the time. But thinking about, if something happens, saying, hey, I'm here for you if you need anything. I'm here if you want to talk, right? Or just trying to do some of that perspective taking and understanding how different experiences are going to impact folks. And that will build trust as you keep going, right? It also plays a really important role in feedback and growing as a team. There's this concept called radical candor. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Dan Gakin actually introduced it to me when I was in grad school. And so thinking about that, there's this idea of ruinous empathy, where if we were meeting and you were on my team and I was like, you're just so great all the time, and I have performance things I wanted to talk to you about or concerns that I had, but I'm just telling you you're great because I don't want to hurt your feelings, that doesn't help you at all. That doesn't help me at all. So empathy is also caring enough about someone to help them be successful and grow and succeed.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's definitely something I've talked about before on this show. I personally struggle with a little bit, being too of that sugarcoating side of things, but it's really interesting to put that into perspective, right? I try to remind myself, and I think sometimes leaders get into this situation where it's I don't want to be, mean or disappointing to somebody that I care about and want to succeed, but you also do need to give, like you said, that candorous feedback, just because if you don't, resentment can build up. Teams cannot function properly. So bringing that kind of empathy, and I think that's a good way to kind of almost reframe your mind, right? Something that I've heard too that helps is thinking about it as kind candor, right? If you're maybe a little bit too afraid to maybe be a little bit too, direct, make sure that obviously you don't need to be, rude about it, right? You can still be kind and have that approach, but love that. What are some ways, I'm curious, because I know some viewers might be thinking I'm on a team or in an organization or something, and I'm not in that leadership role, right? Maybe they don't have that title or that position. What are ways a team member then in that situation, right? And they obviously still could be a leader, anyone can lead. Yeah. How can they kind of bring that culture of empathy into their team if it's not present?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. And culture change is a whole nother, ball game, and trying to think about navigating that. But I think in some past teams I've been a part of, you come in and it can be really hard at first if you want to break in that way, and you tell yourself, ooh, I don't know if I can do this, right? And so it's finding a little bit of courage in yourself to go around and be like, all right, let's say I just joined your team and I'm noticing folks are, not really checking in on each other. I'm going to model that and check in on you when I see you. How are you doing? Is there anything I can help you with, right? And if you share something with me that's maybe personal or something you're struggling with, like, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I'm here if you need anything. I really appreciate you trusting me and sharing that and modeling that kind of as you go. You might be, for the first couple months, the one that models that behavior. And then eventually, because that feels good, right? It feels good to be taken care of and checked in that way, then maybe others will start to go, oh, I can also do that. And you don't have to be the positional leader to do that. You can be sort of an influencer at your level in that way. But if you go in and you're like, oh, I'm not seeing this behavior and I'm going to choose not to engage in that way, then you're just condoning what's already happening. And so it is a little bit of like a self-push, and you don't have to do it, 100% of the time, but trying to find those connections, and it helps you connect with your team, it helps you get to know people, but you have to kind of push yourself a little bit to do it, and then hopefully it'll pay off in the long run.
For sure. So like kind of like taking that initiative, self-peace, and also modeling the way. I think that's so big across the board in leadership. So I'm really glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Really, obviously, again, also can make folks in that room or that team feel comfortable to do so as well, right? So
yeah, that's a big part of it.
Okay. Can you share an example of when empathy made a significant difference in how you approached a situation or handled a challenge? If it's like a personal example, maybe in your career or just wherever.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like it comes up so often, as I consider myself to be kind of a feeler, so I'm so naturally drawn to empathy. But what I think about early in my career, when I was working in Alabama, I had a student that had shared something super deeply personal to me that she was going through, and was able to kind of sit with her and say, hey, we don't need to unpack all the details right now. Or how are you doing? Like, how do you take care of yourself? What does that look like? And that actually continued. She was very emotional, and she continued to talk about, the challenges she had been facing on campus, because everyone else had just been like, okay, well, thanks for sharing, see you later.
Yeah.
She said it was really challenging because no one had taken the time to just sit and be, right, and get to know her as a person. We actually still, it's been 5 or 6 years since I've worked with her directly, and we still talk, and she just let me know she was working on her master's degree and all that stuff, and she's like, that makes a difference, and I want to do that for other people, right?
That's awesome.
And that's the kind of stuff you're like, oh, that's why we do this, right?
Yeah.
But when I think about, she had been in a situation where she felt like folks weren't listening to her, and that she had been kind of getting like canned responses.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's okay. Part of empathy, and I think a little bit in vulnerability too, in that moment, was being like, oh my gosh, like that is hard. And I got a little emotional just in what she had been sharing with me was so personal. But I think that can fuel the humanity in the work that we do.
Yeah.
And I'm not just here to sit in an office and talk to you about stuff, right? Like, I'm here to build a connection and care about you, with whatever limits or boundaries that you have. And I think that helped a lot. And then after that, that pushed through a barrier with her, who had previously been kind of closed off, right? And then after that, we had a lot of check-ins. She'd pop by my office. We talked a lot. And so I was able to kind of support her after that situation as well. And that kind of sticks with me, because you never know who, sometimes, right, we think people are like tough nuts to crack, or we think they are, not as open with us. And then sometimes it's just that right moment of compassion that gets people to open up and see that there's more to them that you haven't uncovered yet.
For sure. Thanks for sharing that example. It's really powerful in terms of, and it kind of connects to what we just talked about a little bit about that relationship building piece. And I'm curious to get your kind of hypothesis. It could be so many different reasons why, but especially in a field like higher education, or just in general, those people working kind of fields, why does that still happen? Why do people maybe kind of shut down a conversation? Does it come from uncomfortability themselves, do you think? What are your thoughts on that? I'm just curious.
I think sometimes it might come from them being shut down themselves, or not finding that themselves. You've probably heard the analogy, you got to put an oxygen mask on first before you take care of others, like they talk about on planes.
Yeah.
And so if you are not breathing the oxygen and you're not taking care of yourself, you can't help the person next to you.
True.
And so I think we know higher education can be really demanding, especially during peak times of the year. And if you're in an environment where you're not getting that support, you're not on a team that models that behavior or care and trust, and maybe is more outcomes focused or doesn't interact much. Maybe it's a small team, maybe it's a team that's not as connected, a newer team or something like that. if you're not feeling that yourself, then it can be really easy to be like, well, this is what I've had modeled for me, so I'm going to kind of move you along. Or, one more thing would be too much for me, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, like, we hope that folks are getting into this field and working with students because they want to have that care and love. But if you over and over again aren't getting that back, then you can't pour into others. So that's kind of my hypothesis, which is why even when I feel low, I try to push through and give that for other people.
For sure.
But even you got to have your own limits too, or then you're going to get to the point where you are that person for someone, which you don't want to be.
Hypothesis.
So that's the hypothesis.
Kind of going from that, then how does one maintain empathy without taking on emotional burnout as a leader? Because I think that like goes into like, it could be a lot, right? To care for people, a lot of different people at a time. So much like that caregiving kind of burnout as well. Do you have any strategies or tips on that to manage that?
Yes, this is something I've definitely learned the hard way in my career. And so I think part of it is understanding your personal boundaries. So if a student comes to you and they have something that requires the help or assistance of a professional that is beyond your scope, I think that's where someone's like, thank you so much for talking to me. I'm so glad you trusted me with this. And I'm here for you in this capacity. And I recognize it sounds like some of the things you shared with me and being able to like echo that back to them. You might need assistance in these ways. And I actually know campus resource, local resource. How can I help connect you? Can I walk over with you? Would you like me to call and see what their availability is like? I've done that for students before.
Okay.
And I think that personal sort of like referral is a big piece of it. And the other piece, I think, is that you have to have your own network or your support group for yourself after that. You know, I'm lucky I have a partner who at home is super listens and pours a lot into me. But he understands that the work that I do is so human-centered and can be really draining. So sometimes I come home and I'm like, I just need to be for a little bit. And that's, you know, we have that relationship and that connection. But I think if you start to feel like you're stretching yourself way too far, you got to figure out how to pour back into yourself. And so sometimes that might be taking time off. Sometimes that might be saying, hey, maybe you have a meeting that you can't miss, right? And a student is pouring their heart out to you, right? And you're like, hey, I love this conversation we're having and I want to check in on you. When could we talk later or tomorrow to continue this conversation, right? Sometimes I've had to do that because sometimes there's those meetings you can't reschedule. And that also gives you a chance to be like, I'm going to take a deep breath, and then I'm going to come back into it. Maybe I've done some research on some resources and stuff. But my big piece of advice is if you don't figure out how to pause and take care of yourself, then you will quickly take on so much emotional labor that you won't be well. And I've definitely experienced that before because you want to be like the helper or the fixer or the person that all the students go to, right? And that's really rewarding. But then you sit down and you're like, oh my gosh, I am so tired. And I've just talked to people all day. And so it's a big part of rebounding from that labor, and you got to kind of figure out what works for you, but you have to intentionally do it or it will be too late. Like you will have burned yourself way past to the point of recovering.
Love that. I think like the intentionality piece is huge with like anything, but especially like finding time to even schedule that time off right in the calendar, right? Or, you know, students that are listening or people that are in their careers, like life's busy, right? You're doing a bunch of different things. And so making sure that you give yourself that time to press, because it's so easy to even say that we're going to do that and then still not, right? Because a million things come up. And so I think that intentional piece is huge there. So thanks for sharing.
Sometimes
that.
having an accountability partner helps too. So like I've been lucky to have colleagues or like my partner to say, hey, you have been running on empty and I see you. Can I help you? Can I tap in and help support you? Have you thought about taking some time off? I've been fortunate to have supervisors that will look at me and be like, you haven't taken time off in a little bit. When's your next, not asking, like, not saying you should take some time off, but framing it more of like, when's your next time off? Or when's your next time away that we can work to make a plan for? And I've appreciated that because I will be very open and say, sometimes I'll just run, right? And I need a little bit of that. And so that helps a lot too, because you get the time off, you get the benefits, right? Like for students, I think you get fall break, right? Try and make that time that you can bounce back.
Right. Just filling it with things to do, if possible. Interesting. So question for you, is there a time when too much empathy can turn into a bad thing? And like what are some signs of that, if that's a thing?
That's a really good question. I think sometimes if we want to sit in the feelings a lot, it can keep us from getting to action steps. And so I do think there is so much value in being empathetic in your role. And if I just sat around and empathized with folks all day, we would never get anything done.
For sure.
And so sometimes it's knowing how to move a conversation to thank you for sharing this to me, and what does next steps look like for you? Or, you know, in one-on-ones with when I supervised undergraduate students, it would be, okay, so we're getting towards the end of our time. What's something you're gonna do for yourself today, right? Or you've talked about all these things you're taking care of. What is one thing Brandon's gonna go do for themselves today? And trying to shift it that way, because if I sat with them for an hour and we just got super emotional, and then we get to the cutoff time and they're like, well, I gotta go to class, then like there's no resolution and we just sat in feelings, and that may or may not have been the best ending for them because they may be feeling unfinished. And I also think that sometimes as leaders, we have to make tough calls. We have to get action things together. And so, one of my strengths is futuristic, right? And so if I wanted to sit in empathy all of the time, I definitely could, but I'm always thinking about how can we grow, develop, be better in the future, right? And so I can use that to help inform it, but sometimes we talk about even like true colors, right? Like I'm a blue as well, but you got to sometimes find it in yourself to be like, all right, and we got to keep the momentum going, right? Because we can't just sit in empathy all the time, which I recognize. But we want to translate like forward progress too. But yeah,
kind of like that balance approach to anything. Right? Again, just making sure obviously that it's present, but also too that things can be done. And I think probably figures to that team you're working with, those people, right? Because everyone's different in terms of those needs, and there might be more of a naturally empathetic group, right? Or those groups that are more in tune with those feelings and those connections versus a group that might be like, let's get it done, right? And so
and I think understanding that on your team is so essential too. So we've done inventories on our teams before, and I can understand that, right? Like these 3 people are really action oriented, and so they can help pull us out of the let's feel and process that a little bit, right? Or maybe sometimes the action folks are like, well, have we considered the impact of these things, right? And so it's that balance, like you said, because it's important to have different perspectives and ways of doing on your team. Now, sometimes you might get a team where you're all similar, and then someone maybe has to go, okay, and how are we going to challenge ourselves to incorporate something a little different, right? Because then you're all sitting around like, oh my gosh, and how do you feel about that, right? And how did that make you feel? So,
Okay. Good stuff. So how can leaders or individuals work on building empathy? Obviously, it's a skill that can be developed and worked on. A lot of those human skills are the same way. So do you have any advice or, ways that folks can do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, I love starting with the Brene Brown video for folks that haven't thought about empathy and vulnerability and sympathy before as kind of a starting point, just to see some language that's modeled. And some of her books also have some really cool activities that I've done with folks before, where you look at, statements and you say, is this empathy or is this dismissive, right? Or how do we navigate that? But I also think a key piece of this is asking for feedback when you're trying to support someone, especially if empathy doesn't come as naturally to you, or if you are seeking to lean into that more. So, for example, if we were talking and you're sharing something with me, maybe instead of me jumping to my instinct of what I want to say or what I think might be correct, maybe I say, how would you feel most supported in this moment, right? Or what support do you need in a situation like this? And also not assuming that you have to have the right thing to say. Because I think so often we want to jump straight to like, oh my gosh, that happened to me, and da-da-da-da-da, here's all this. And sometimes it's okay, I don't really know what to say right now, but I'm just here to support you. And what could that look like for you? That is empathy. Sure. But we want to problem solve. We want to have instantaneous responses all of the time. And sometimes it's okay to say, what would that look like for you, right? And you may even offer, like, this is what it might look like for me, but we're not the same person, so what would it look like for you? And that's a really good start to start thinking about that. And then as it becomes more natural, it will start infusing that. But I also think not quickly jumping to judgment or action mode all of the time, because it's super easy if you share something, you're like, oh, well, I can recall a situation that happened to a friend or someone, and I just want to jump right back into that and tell you what they did and how that worked or didn't work. But it's like, it's not always your place to give advice. Sometimes you just need to listen.
I mean, that can be challenging too for people, because obviously we want to naturally connect, and that's a way. I think a lot of times we think of, like, if I share a similar experience, we're gonna have something in common, where I can try to show that I'm coming from that understanding piece, and that can be really challenging, especially when you're in mode is to help people, right? You might go into more of that advice kind of. I know I personally struggle with that a lot, and stuff. And sometimes, like, I think even asking, like, hey, are you looking for advice now, or do you just want to kind of share, can help too,
right?
And in certain situations as well. But yeah, I mean, it can be tough, but it's so important to kind of get started building that. I think I appreciate you sharing those things. I think those are very tangible things folks can do to just kind of can jump in and embrace that on their leadership journey. So
it doesn't happen overnight either. Like, you're not gonna, hopefully if you're listening to this, like, you're not gonna walk out tomorrow and be like, I am an empathy-centered leader, right? And you can value that and you can strive towards it, but it's also not perfect, right? I mean, there are situations where you support someone and they're like, I don't know if that helped me. And sometimes you can say, okay, let's, why don't we reconnect tomorrow? And maybe we can think about some new strategies, right, instead. And, finding that piece to be okay with owning when it doesn't go correct either, because that is also a big piece of it. And not every person is going to fit the same strategies that might have worked for you before.
Right, yeah.
And so there's, like, dynamics, there's folks' background and, like, their experiences. All are going to play a shape into how they navigate what is going to work for them in a support situation.
Yeah. Got to stay open-minded, right?
Yes, absolutely.
That kind of goes into this next question, actually, that I had for you. What advice would you give to leaders trying to understand different perspectives across different cultures, identities, and even some of those generational differences we've seen? And again, too, these are always, like, generalizations, I like to say, but what are some of those things?
Yeah, I think always trying to listen to hear people and understand their nuances of, like, how they're experiencing things, and not just listening and be like, okay, great, I know X, Y, and Z that I can shoot back at you right away, right? Not really what you're looking for if you're trying to achieve an empathy-driven approach. But I think also listening, trying to broaden your horizons through what you're learning, right? And so I think about, I've lived in many different states, I've worked at many different institutions, and always taking the opportunity to maybe meet folks that I haven't had the chance to work with before, have those conversations, pay attention to what's happening in the world around you, and understand how students or folks you may be working with, right, could be impacted by those things. And if someone does trust you and share that with you, be like, wow, thank you so much for sharing that with me. Like, you trust me in sharing that, and so I want to learn more. And if you have that connection and folks are open to pointing you in a direction to share, but it's not others' role to educate you on everything in the world too. So you have to take that piece of, I encourage folks to do some self-reflection, there's some really great resources that you can sit and look at and go, okay, what areas of the world have I not yet discovered, right? What identities, peoples, backgrounds have I not taken the time to really dive into? And so doing some of that self-work, I think, is really critical. Uncovering things that might be in the unconscious that we don't always think about. Right. Because it's really easy for folks to come and be like, yep, I've had XYZ experience, so I understand XYZ person. It's like, that's not necessarily the case, right? Because we can only understand how much folks are willing to share with us. Yeah. So just approaching a lot with, like, curiosity and just trying to be open-minded and empathetic, and not just necessarily jump into, like, I read this once, so that means you must want X, Y, and Z from me. It's like, that person's experience is not what you've necessarily learned. So it's just a jumping off point.
Okay. So kind of prioritizing almost that, like, lifelong learning piece is huge, right? But also to, just being around people is a good way, I think, to jump into that, and asking questions, right? Learning how to ask questions, being curious, open-minded, all those good things. So yeah. Okay. Sweet. What are some practical ways leaders can cultivate empathy within their teams or organizations? Or we kind of talked about that a little bit, so maybe flipping it to how can leaders kind of instill those skills in other people, right? Build those skills in others.
Yeah, and I think if you are, let's say, like a supervisor or a manager, and you have that positional power, I think it goes back to role modeling, which we've talked about, but also I think it's really critical to give feedback, or even as appropriate in situations, saying, like, hey, how could we think about this in a different way, right? And so I would encourage folks in those roles to do that self-work, but then get ready to encourage others to do that self-work as well. And so maybe that's facilitating a conversation about radical candor, and you sit and go, how have we seen this show up in our work, right? And where do you naturally find yourself drawn? Not that, and trying not to frame it in a deficit-based model, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's what's really hard is whenever we do professional development as humans, we automatically go to, oh, I don't have that, so therefore I am bad. And I think as a leader modeling, we're not saying that at all. We want to just continue to grow and pour into this particular skill set. And so how can we help you demonstrate these skills better and not, I'm observing that we're not empathetic, and so therefore we're all screwing up, right? And so that's not what we want to see. We want to see people who are committed to learning, growing, and being connected. And so if you rely on deficit-based thinking, that can really inhibit your organization. If you're coming in always as a leader and saying, we need to do X, Y, and Z better, right? Instead of, I would love to pour some skills into us or some building for us to continue to grow in this area, right? Now, if you have someone who is maybe, potentially like damaging your organization or demonstrating, like the antithesis of empathy, and they're, maybe overly negative, or they're harming folks, right, in any kind of way, I do think it's valuable to have those one-on-one conversations and owning, like, hey, this is what we're hoping to create. How can I help you see yourself in that, right?
For
like
sure.
what support do you need? Because again, depending on where you are in an organization or the level of trust you have, they may have stuff going on that you don't know about. And so trying to approach it with a lot of curious thinking and like those conversations instead of just straight to, we're not empathetic in this group, so therefore I'm going to require everybody read this book and everyone do some self-work, and then we're going to be empathetic. That's not how that works, right?
Yeah.
And so it's also, I think, accepting feedback from those positionally below you, which is hard to do, because when you get to a certain level, you're like, great, I will deliver the message down, but it goes both ways, right?
Sure.
And so that openness, and maybe that looks like 360 feedback evaluations where folks from across, up and down can give you feedback. Maybe it's informational interviews that you conduct with people to see how you're doing and what the culture of the organization needs. But if you sit and you hope that everything's just going to be great because you say it is, it won't be.
Right.
You have to put in the work, which is hard
Yeah.
and takes commitment. But
For sure.
if you're putting in the work, then that is emulated throughout your organization.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really like you sharing, or how you shared that perspective of like how a lot of people maybe approach that potential growth or those developmental opportunities from that deficit mindset. I've never thought about it in that way before, actually. But that's such a key, again, reframe of how to approach that. Like, hey, like, we might not be where we want to be within these skills or these areas, but, we're going to work on those things instead of looking at like, hey, like, I don't have this, so, I'm not going to try. Or it just really sets the tone for more of a negative outlook on those things. And so, that was really cool. Start to think about that for sure. And I think it's really impactful because, like, you even said earlier, like you shared about that modeling the way piece, right? And people are present. They observe, especially those folks that maybe more have that leadership position, right? And things like that. And so people are always watching. And so even just trying to figure out how to model things in a more positive way or that thinking, I think could really change a team's or an organization's outlook on things pretty quickly, I would assume, once that gets into like that new habit or practice. So that was really cool.
It's in alignment with the public and private values too.
Yeah.
So sometimes we talk about like what is the outward facing view of an organization or a team, right? What are the perceptions that others have? And then what is happening behind the closed doors, right? So if you say maybe in a larger team meeting, hey, everyone, like we're doing so great. I love that we're building this skill. Keep up the great work. I'm open to feedback. And then you get into a meeting with maybe a smaller subset of people and you're frustrated and you're yelling and you're not conveying that, then now there's this incongruence of your values. Exactly. And so it's that commitment in all spaces and like modeling the way like you talked about. And so you got to show it everywhere, which is, it takes work, but it's important. And think about like K-12, right, education, it is kind of a little bit of a deficit-based model, right?
Yeah.
You don't get the grade you want, you need to do better, right? You need to do X, Y, and Z to pass or whatever. And even our, college students are seeing that. And so taking the time to say, okay, maybe you're not an expert, and we never want to strive for perfection, right? Because there's always room for growth and learning. but I want to help you level up a little bit. That's language I've used before. Like, hey, I'm hearing that you're struggling with like a specific conversation. How can I help you level up to feel more confident and prepared for that kind of work? So you have to reframe how you pitch it to people too.
For sure, the audience and maybe what they're going through. But I love that piece too, like leveling up and like the idea of just getting a little bit better each day, because over time that's really going to compound, right? You just feel a lot of growth. And I think, honestly, you know, I've noticed this too with mostly young adults in the population we work with, and I think I throw, you know, myself included in people that I know as well as professionals. But, you know, the idea of like sometimes we hold ourselves back because we're not an expert, quote unquote, in a topic, you know what I mean? And like whether that's, you know, you wanted to share some thoughts on, you know, LinkedIn or some things with industry, and I think that holds people back from sharing things, which is, you know, deeply kind of sometimes unfortunate, because like think about all the knowledge and learning we could share with each other if we didn't look so hard at that expert piece, but more of like, hey, I'm a work in progress, right? I'm learning about this too. I know I've definitely held myself back as well in that area. Like, what do I know? I know I'm just this young adult about this thing, but it's like maybe if I did share something that might, you know, spark a new piece of learning for someone else, right? And it's that idea of like, you know, shifting even from that mentality, like, you know, being an expert. And sometimes, let's be real, being an expert can be kind of boring too, right? If you're learning the same thing, spending hours and hours, which is, you know, it's still important to do that, but like kind of, you know, being open to just improving a little bit each day. So
yeah, absolutely.
So good stuff. How do you respond when someone's emotions or experiences differ greatly from your own in experience? I don't know if you have any personal examples that you don't want to share, or just like any tips or advice to folks, because I know a lot of the time, I think that's can also hold folks back from maybe giving feedback, right? Or even asking for your feedback. Because some people don't want to get into those situations where, you know, there's some discourse in between emotions. I think we see a lot of that, those differences in things, especially in today's world, you know, whether that's virtually or even in person. Like just the idea, people are just not maybe like communicating in person a lot to approach things, but we know there's so much upside to talking through differences, right? New learning, new perspective makes you, I think, a better overall human. So what are some ways folks can maybe like, you know, learn how to leverage that, but also to even go into that empathy mindset when they're in a, you know, a situation where there are some big differences or disagreements?
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially with, like you said, the virtual space. And I mean, we see more and more folks are texting those that they're around, right, or Snapchat or Instagram, whatever, and less of the face-to-face, which is where you can't read tone virtually, right? And even if it's in all caps or whatever, maybe you can read that tone, but you know, trying to understand someone's perspective, their emotion, their positionality, you can't read that virtually. And so as much as possible, I always encourage, if someone wants to have a conversation, to be in person. And so there's a couple things that I have seen over my career that have helped. And so one of the things I think about is, let's say maybe there was a situation in like a meeting or something, and you want to unpack what someone said more deeply outside of the space, right? You want to have a one-on-one conversation with them. And I think it's really valid to open with, hey, you know, I heard you say this in the meeting today. I would love to unpack that more and talk more about that with you. Are you in a space to do that now, or would you like to find some time later to do that? Because depending on the context, right, if it was an emotionally charged statement, they might be all the way elevated up here and not ready to have discourse or something like that. So I think that's one strategy I've used. I think sometimes too, I'm thinking about an example of in a past role that I had, where I had a group of students come to me and say, hey, we're experiencing this on campus and we're really challenged by it, and we want some assistance in trying to navigate that. And so bringing that to the person that I reported to and saying, hey, this is what I'm hearing from my students. Right. This is a problem. How do we navigate that? And, you know, it's impacting them, and being told like, oh, that doesn't seem like it's a big deal, right? And so clearly we're like right off the bat differing on that. And so what I needed to do, and this goes back to knowing your team and building trust, is I needed to understand how to make that situation relatable and tangible in a way that that person would understand what the impact is. And so I found that they were less of a like in-person office, like formal meeting, and they rather would have like a conversation with students or have that connection piece directly from the source, which is great, which is valuable. And so inviting them in and be like, hey, would you mind just coming to talk to some of my students? You know, we're thinking about these things, you know, and having to adapt my approach was really valuable. But if I had just left it at that well, it doesn't seem like a big deal. It's, well, maybe. And then, so then I'm wondering, did I convey it correctly? Like, these students trust me. I'm talking to them about it, right? And so sometimes it's understanding, like, well, pushing back a little bit, right, in a way that feels, in a way that you're able to, and say, well, it is important to them. And so how do I help you see their perspective a little bit, right? Or what does that look like to bring you into the conversation, because they're specifically seeking your involvement. And so that, I think, is another piece too, is understanding that, like, time, place, manner maybe varies for people's ability to have conversations. Maybe they are, maybe the space that they're in is a space where they don't feel comfortable and they want to have these conversations, but they do better if they're able to walk and talk, or, have just like a different setting, because then maybe they're able to not bring feelings, good or bad, back into that space, right? Because space matters. And so if you think about, okay, if I have this conversation here, am I going to remember this every time I walk into the room? So maybe it's finding a neutral setting or finding somewhere else to talk about it. And I think it's, I think what is so challenging with, like, online conversations and all those pieces is it feels like there has to be, everyone wants to so fervently, like, defend everything, right? Yeah. Which is impactful. I love that people are passionate, right? But I think when you're trying to have a conversation with someone, especially someone on your team, you got to think about, how can I hear you, right? And those empathy pieces of, I may not agree with you, but how do we move forward together? Right. Especially someone that you're working with, right? And you need to have that conversation. It's like, okay, so thanks for sharing that with me. I don't necessarily agree with that. And so I'm just curious about how you feel this maybe could impact our working relationship moving forward, or how do you think we could work together on this, knowing that we both have different perspectives on this. And sometimes it's about naming that, right? Yeah. But it's about just trying to figure out how you can kind of recalibrate to being on the same team, right? Because we can't always pick the teams that we're on.
No, for sure.
But it's about, how do you try and meet people and understand and provide opportunities for growth and learning? Because if I came in and I was super heated and I said, you're wrong and here's all the reasons why, then someone's going to shut down. Yeah. But so if I provide an opportunity to share my perspective, then that gives people the opportunity to change their mind and grow and develop. But if we come in up here, they're going to meet your energy, and then you can't hope for any growth or learning. Yeah. So I think those are some of the things that I've seen work over the years, and that I would encourage people to try.
Yeah. I like those. Thanks for sharing that. Like, I think the piece of, like, managing your own emotions, especially going into that, and that can be challenging too. Again, like, you're very passionate about something, or something means a lot, to you or someone you care about. It can be a challenge, but it's so important. And I think too, like, the idea that we can remind ourselves a little bit is, like, even with some big differences, usually there's some piece that we can find for commonality in between, right? And I think, like, maybe even searching for that might be a little bit helpful. Yeah. I mean, obviously it depends very much on the situation, and everyone's different, but how can one, this is tough, right? If someone isn't, really open to have that conversation, if there's that disagreement, is there a way you can kind of build that bridge to eventually have that? Because that can be tough, right? When you're in that mindset, like, hey, I want to work through this, and the other person just kind of shuts you down, right? Doesn't want to hear about it, doesn't want to do anything, even if you've done, the steps of giving them space or approaching it in a positive manner. Some people just aren't maybe in that place or ready to do that. Is there a way to get there, or how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think it's important to try and keep the door open, the proverbial door open, right? And saying, hey, you know what? I hear you. It seems like, this is not a space you're ready to be in, or you want to have this conversation. I'm here when you're ready to talk about this. And so I just want you to know that, like, I'm open to that, and just keeping it as an opportunity. There may be folks that don't want to engage in that conversation, and that's also where I think you have to have your support network, because it's really easy to sit and ruminate and continually go, all I'm thinking about is this, and how they won't engage and they won't have this conversation, and and then that could lead to storytelling, or that can lead to perceptions of, like, an individual, and so it's really easy to get caught up in that. I mean, I think about, like, stories that go viral, and so quickly we've, like, not slowed ourselves down. And so if someone doesn't want to engage, I think you have to figure out how you find that peace in yourself to say, I tried, I want to have this conversation, just demonstrating openness, but then you have to figure out how to take care of yourself on the back end of not everyone may be ready to have those conversations. Yeah,
for sure. I think too, like, you've been, we're talking so much about, having empathy for others, for yourself as well, right? Especially that. And sometimes, again, like, like you said a little bit earlier as well, is we don't always know what's going on with somebody, right? And so even going to that mindset, and I think we've talked about this on this show a couple times with other guests about, like, you know, we're so hard on ourselves sometimes, especially those folks that are, I think a lot of viewers are, obviously they're kind of invested in their personal development if they're listening. And so, I mean, it's just like one of those things. I think that mindset, like you mentioned, that strong support system is such a huge win, just because, again, like, it can be challenging. And a lot of people might start telling ourselves those different, you know, those narratives or like those things that aren't true, which that gets us into trouble, right? Because now we're just kind of, again, in the future, that also might close us off to even having that conversation if that person does come around, right, and ready to have that. And so, and I think it really takes a lot of work at self-work, but it's so important. And, you know, when done and you know, invested into, is a huge plus for someone to have those skills. And we need more of that, I think, too, in the world. So, I mean, are people being willing to take that on? And so, yeah.
And even if you have that conversation, and you do have a conversation about something, right, and it goes really poorly, allowing space at the end to be like, this feels like this was kind of a rough road to get to this conversation, right? Like, how are you feeling right now? Like, how, maybe in the future, if we have disagreement, how could we approach that, right?
For sure.
And maybe that doesn't happen in the moment, but you could be like, hey, you know, I'm thinking about just like the way that conversation ended, and I'm wondering like what maybe would have been better for you, like how I could have approached it differently with you in the future, and maybe they have feedback, and maybe you can share feedback, right? And that's part of growing and being better, because if you come in and you're like, it just feels like we weren't like quite there, maybe they've had some thinkings about that too, right? And so you have to have patience and grace with yourself too, which is hard, because you're like, I want this to be resolved, right? Like, I want it to be resolved right now, but that's not necessarily how it's going to play out.
For sure. Yeah, that patience one is a big one, important skill to learn and have. And I love that too, that perspective again of just like, you know, let's just have conversation. Even if it's not a positive outcome or the outcome we looked for, we can still talk about it, right? And find ways, how can we improve for the future, right? Make it better. Or again, and sometimes it's like taking that step, like, even if you don't feel like you made a mistake or you're wrong, sometimes, you know, just even like apologizing for maybe how that came off, or just, you know, people like to say like, be the bigger person in the situation, but like, it goes deeper than that. I think just like, you know, being open again and sharing that, and again, I think that all ties into empathy, right? Having that perspective of like, that coming from that care, like the wanting to work together and co-create those different experiences in a relationship versus just like, you know, telling or pushing. And so, yeah. Having the opportunity to talk about how your intent was versus the impact of how it landed is a huge part of that, because if you're running away from that and you're like, Audrey said X, Y, and Z to me, and I'm just so mad, I can't believe she thought this, and then we get to have a conversation, I'm like, tell me what you walked away with, right? And if you're like X, Y, and Z, be like, oh my gosh, thank you for telling me that was not my intent, so I apologize, like that's not how I wanted to convey that message, and so thank you for giving me an opportunity to explain myself, because we don't, and I'll tell people, like, we don't always get that, right? Like, we don't always get to a second chance to explain ourselves. And so I think that piece is huge too, is clarifying, like, hey, I'm feeling like there's a disconnect here, right? And so what pieces of that conversation are sitting with you, and how can I help maybe clarify what I meant? Because we don't, you don't want to assume bad intent. Right. But when we talk, like, we think about the deficit model, right? Like, immediately you're like, oh, they are judging me for this, or they're mad at me for this. And so it's finding that place where you can say, how did I get it wrong? And what can be different next time? Definitely. Yeah. And just like having that open mind and that space. And again, too, like, that might be a great way, because again, sometimes that can be nerve-wracking to have conversations. If they're not, maybe you have a feeling they might not go, you know, a particular way, but like taking that again and reframing that as like, this is an opportunity for me to learn something as well, right? Especially when you have that example of like, I didn't realize, you know, I made you feel this way, or having that second chance. Like, again, that's in a way that person gave you that, like, that's going to change how you approach hopefully future interactions, and that might give you some insight too on your own personal communication that you never saw before, because it was in that blind area, right? And so bringing those out, and so really framing again maybe those not the most positive interactions, but they can be if we treat it as a learning moment and that growth. And I think that's such an important perspective. We talked about it a bunch, you know, on this show, but it's really, really important. Obviously, that's why it's a common theme that keeps coming up. So yeah, exactly. So we've shared a little bit about feedback. obviously, you know, giving, receiving feedback, two very different skills. What are some ways folks can do that through an empathetic lens of giving feedback and then also, you know, receiving feedback?
Yeah. So this over the last year or so, I had an opportunity to supervise professional staff for a little bit. And so one of the conversations that I like to have with someone, if we're unpacking something, like, hey, are you ready for some feedback, or do you want some feedback about your approach, or would you rather, you know, we can just unpack this and we can go back to feedback later, right? And I think you talked about this earlier, like clearness in feedback is kindness, and empathy is all connected to that. And so if there's a situation, maybe policy-wise or like structurally, that wasn't handled the best, right? Or wasn't handled according to whatever standards have to be held to, you're doing someone a disservice if you get to the wrap-up phase of it or debrief and you're saying, yeah, that was great, right?
Yeah.
Now, sometimes you have to challenge yourself and say, do I, as the person giving feedback, think that situation could have been handled differently because it's not how I would have done it? And we still got the same result and it was fine at the end, right?
Yeah.
You have to challenge yourself there because you don't necessarily need everyone to do things just like you. So that's a challenge I would have out there.
That's a huge insight. Do you mind saying that again?
Yeah. So if you're giving feedback, you don't want to, you know, we're going from point A to point B. And if the way the person got from A to B is different than how I would have done it, my feedback shouldn't be, that's great, but I would have done it this way.
Yeah.
If there's nothing that was missed structurally, like nothing required was missed, they just handled it a different way because we're all different humans. You need to challenge yourself and say, hold on, is the feedback I'm hoping to give actually constructive and helpful, or is it just my own perception? And so I think that is a hard lesson to learn because the way you were taught or the way you experienced something is how you're going to assume others are going to do it. But if people are cared for, everyone's safe, if the administrative pieces were taken care of, then, you know, what's the difference? But if you were trying to give feedback on, maybe we almost got from point A to point B, and you maybe are like like right between the middle, and I am now here to give you advice on how to get a little bit further, right? I think it's important to talk to them about, hey, so how are you feeling about how this went, right? Tell me about your feelings, because they might express, you know, lack of confidence or some anxiety about the situation. And you're like, great, thank you so much for sharing that for me. I also noticed some of these things, right? Because I felt that maybe you could have been stronger in your approach, or, you know, having specific examples that you can it's helpful for people to self-reflect first.
Yeah.
Because then you can kind of co-sign it. And you'd be like, and now that we've talked about these things, how would we do this last quarter mile, right? Like, what would that last part be for you? After I don't know, I'm stuck. Be like, okay, great. So if it was me handling it, right, or according to policy, right, we needed to do these things. How can I help you feel more prepared to do that next time? Or what do you need to feel like you can handle that next part? Because I think you can handle it, right? And it's a little bit of that, remember, you're here for a reason. You're doing XYZ task for a reason. I think you can handle it, but how can I help you feel like you can do it? Yeah. Which I think is really hard to do because deficit mindset, right? You want to come and be like, Brandon, you did not do your credit card paperwork on time. What happened here, right? And it's like, okay, talk to me about it. Did you not understand the process, right? Yeah. Did we not explain it to you? Did you have any challenges along the way? Did you have questions that I didn't answer, right? And so there's not always those situations, right? And you have to handle those through a frame of I care about you. Here's what needs to be different. Here's the why behind it. But I think, if I think about some classes that I attended in college, right? If everybody fails an exam, then is it on the students or is it on the instructor? Right? And so there's a little bit of that open-ended experience. And so if I've explained something not the best, or if I've not given you the tools to succeed, and I'm just sitting here assuming because I know how to do something that you know how to do it, and I explained it not very well, did I take into account different learning styles? Did I take into account different approaches and people's experiences? If I didn't, then maybe I need to loop back and say, how can we continue to talk about this and improve it? And I think that's a big piece of it too, because it's hard to give feedback, but it's not always, there are situations, right, where it can feel more punitive. And I think that's really where it's really important to show trust and empathy and display that you care about them and separate, this is what happened, and moving forward, I need to be different. But that doesn't change how I'm here to support you, right? Yeah. But if there are pieces where you can pour into people more, then owning that piece and asking for feedback yourself, right? Like, so now that we've talked about this, what do you feel like you need to be successful? And sometimes they'll say, I just need to do it. And be like, okay, great. So next time that happens, let's check in about how you feel like it goes and see what the differences are in those experiences. But you got to know people you're working with too.
Yeah.
That's
really
a huge piece of it.
Yeah, right.
So I think those are some of the things I would think about in that situation.
Yeah. I love where you're going with that too, especially like in a situation. I think this happens pretty often, right? And they can be challenging, whether that's, again, in a student organization, a team, something in a business career, whatever it may be, working with people. The idea of like, sometimes we, maybe assume that folks now carrying the test because we've done it before know how to do it when that's not the case at all, right? And going into that mind of like, okay, taking a pause. And I think what you mentioned a little bit ago about the idea of, not also projecting just the way you did it, because everyone's going to approach things differently, but finding that the similarity of like, okay, maybe this thing got achieved perfect, that's great in this different way. That might teach you as well, right? Oh, there's different ways of doing this. Or like, that was a really good way. I never thought of that, right? Or maybe it's more efficient. But the idea of like, sometimes I think we see folks getting stuck, well, it should be common sense, right? But like you gave that another example of like with the exam thing. Instructor's fault or group of students' fault. Well, again, taking that accountability piece I think is so important, especially as a leader embraces that and taking responsibility for things like, again, if you gave your team an objective and it failed, that may be a really great chance for you to look at that and self-work and be like, maybe that's on me as a leader, right? I didn't communicate the goals or what we were trying to achieve, or maybe I had too many assumptions coming in. And that can be painful to do, right? Anytime you do self-work, but it's so imperative to do that to improve, right? And to actually get those results that are being looked for. And so and that's a great kind of insight to share that you shared around the idea of, making sure that we really take the opportunity to also look, when we're giving feedback as well. Because again, it can be really easy to be like, well, you could have done X, Y, and Z better. Okay. But like, again, there might be a little bit more to the story there than before we tell each other, before we say that. So interesting stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, feedback. Still on that topic a little bit. What are some ways people who maybe have had a negative experience with feedback kind of learn how to find ways to ask for feedback? 'Cause it's so important that we ask for feedback ourselves, right? So we can get that self-awareness and things that we brought out of our blind spot or blind area into what we can see to work on. 'Cause I know, it can be challenging if you've gotten negative feedback or not feedback in a positive way before, to be open to asking for it. But it's so important for self-growth.
Yeah, especially, right? You've been burned before. Do you want to ask for feedback because you feel like it's just going to be maybe unfounded or not substantiated in any way, right? And so I think what's really important is when you get to you join a new team, right? You're setting expectations. I think finding it in yourself, be like, I would love to hear feedback from folks, right? And so feedback doesn't also always have to be a formal sit-down conversation where you're like, tell me how I did on that, right? Or can you update me on my performance or whatever? It could be smaller interactions, right? So maybe we facilitate a training and then we're walking away after it and I'm like, so how do you think it went, right? And if you're like, I don't know, I think it was all right. And I feel like, well, how could I have helped you feel like it was better than all right? Here's what I'm seeing. What did you see? And so sometimes it's just that debrief conversation and then you can loop back around. Okay, we're planning the next one. Last time we talked about this. What do we need to be better for the next one? So I think that is kind of hard. It also can kind of be in that personal reflection piece and finding a little bit of courage and empathy with your team. And you can say, to a supervisor or manager, something like that, you could say, hey, in the past when I've gotten feedback, I have felt like maybe it was really surface level or it was pretty negative about this area. So I'm a little nervous or maybe even insecure about approaching this conversation with you, but I also am committed to learning and growing and being better. And so how do you like to give feedback, and how can I, maybe having that conversation of, if it's critical feedback, can we prepare for it can you send me an email in advance? Hey, these are the things I want to talk about so I can prepare. Or, if it's, some people prefer to praise in public, critique in private. Some people don't like any kind of attention publicly and would rather unpack that in a certain setting. But I think trying to be a little bit upfront and saying like, hey, this has not gone well for me before when I've asked for feedback. So like, I'm nervous right now, even if you're about to give me great feedback, because this is the experience I've had.
Yeah.
And so also trying to not freeze frame people before, or freeze frame your experience and yourself before you've even given someone the opportunity to do that for you. And so I think that can be really hard as well. It's definitely not an easy thing to do, but it goes with that like openness and naming it too, right? We're all human. Like, hey, I've had horrible experiences in the past with X, Y, and Z. And so I'm really nervous about how this is going to go right now. So, you know, I just wanted to name that up front. So talk me through it, right?
For sure. I think that upfront communication is really critical too, because like sometimes also, you know, when you're looking for feedback and you just ask someone, they might not have some, you know, like giving them time to process so they can give you effective feedback that you can actually take and improve on. That's really helpful too. And a point thing I think sometimes people miss on, it's like, hey, again, maybe sending a simple note or asking, maybe it's your supervisor, teammate, whatever it may be, like, hey, you know, I'm looking for feedback. And I think that's a really great way to do that as well. Maybe sending an email or a note to 5 people you're looking for feedback from, and being, you know, and sharing like, hey, I really would like your honest feedback. If you could please find some time to deliver that. I'm trying to improve. And also reassuring folks when you're asking for feedback that you're open and ready to receive it as well can help too. Because again, some other people have had bad experiences giving feedback, right? So also taking that into account, like, okay, but I think that's great. And if you are in that supervision role or a leadership role, whatever it may be, or you're looking to establish more of that culture, you said, I think it's really great to talk to those people, right, individually. Again, in your case, I'm assuming, but as a supervisor, you've probably asked people in your supervision, like, how do you like to receive feedback? Or maybe you have those one-on-one meetings and show up, and that's super, super critical, again, and super important. And people really appreciate that, too. And I think it's that thoughtful approach to something that can, you know, unfortunately gets demonized a little bit, but is so important, right? You know, or people have, you know, those misconceptions around feedback. So,
and that's a really good point about seeking out. If you know someone, or you have like a mentor or someone in an organization, you're like, wow, they do this really well. Talk to them, be like, hey, so I noticed that you give really good feedback, and not good necessarily as positive, but like, I love the way you frame things, or talk to me about your approach or what considerations you have. And that can be really impactful too, to hear someone else's perspective, especially if it's something you struggle with. And maybe they'll point you to, oh yeah, you should talk to this person because they're the one that helped me, or here's an article I read that helped change my perspective. Or it's also okay sometimes to do a little like practice, or think about like how you're going to deliver feedback. You could, you know, record yourself on your phone saying it and then listen back to it. Is that feedback you would be comfortable receiving? And then I know it's kind of cringe to listen to your own voice, but, you know, play it back for yourself and go, okay, so maybe that word doesn't like land with me as correctly. And not that you need to write out a script, but just thinking about, do I feel humanized if I was receiving this? And if the answer is no, then maybe think about what that would look like if it was different.
That's such a good tool or a way to do that, is to practice it, because you can actually hear maybe how your tonality comes. Because a lot of times, sometimes when we tell, you know, we talk to ourselves, we say it in our mind, it comes out completely different out loud, right? Or people interpret that. That's actually a really, really good idea to do that and to practice that. To, again, like, or if you can do, or if you have someone and, you know, you trust, or someone that can work with you, like, practice that, right? Pretend, do a little, you know, kind of model of how this feedback goes. That's a really, really cool insight. That's a good idea. Write that down. Like, talk to yourself or record yourself in your phone to see how it comes across. That's great. If you could change one thing in the world in relation to leadership, what would it be?
Wow. That's like the earth-shattering question right there, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think that something that I would change, and so what I think is really interesting, like the longer I'm in higher education, I'm always like, yes, we want to uplift and we want to raise people up, right? But what I tend to notice is sometimes when we get to see people ascend positionally to those roles, then it becomes like, great, I made it, I'm here. And you don't need to think about how to elevate folks or continue to incorporate all the people, right, positionally that like continue to report to you. And so I think if I could change anything, it would be when folks are in those positional power positions, that they are not forgetting about how they got there, and they're not forgetting about the rest of the organization. Whether, you know, if you're in a student organization and you become the president, right, you don't want to forget about the members that helped elect you, because that's who you're representing, and just like that true goodness at your core of, you know, we would love to see that happen in corporations and all that thing, right? Like, think about leaders that are remembered. It's people who are, hey, I know the president on a first name basis, and when they see me on campus, they smile and they ask me how I'm doing, right?
Yeah.
Or they have taken the time to stop by and talk to me about the work that I'm doing. I worked at a campus where, the person who was in the leadership position would often talk to us at like random campus events, would pop by, would be very like authentic in talking with us, and was infused into the community. And you were like, wow, this person doesn't even feel like they are positionally up here because they're taking the time to talk to us. And I think that's something that gets missed a lot of the time, right? You're like, I made it to the top and now I'm here and I don't have to think about anybody else. But that's, how did you get there, right?
Right.
There are people who are still where you were once. Who could support and need guidance and would love to be poured into by the people, like similarly to how you got poured into. So that would be, if I could change it, if I had a magic wand, I could change anything.
Yeah. No, 100%. I mean, like you see that everywhere, right? Whether it's, I read in our government, right? Or like business or whatever, maybe our student organizations. Like, I think that is such a missed opportunity to continue of like that idea when people like, again, like maybe you've had that goal, right, to become this, in this role, but it's again, like once you believe you've kind of made that level or rise, like you don't grow, you start to lose that influence you built. You almost take a step back on that leadership if you're looking at those tiers of leadership, right? Because like that's the first step, right? You probably got in that spot because of your results, but also to your relationships. You got to continue that even more, right? And then the idea is shifting from that into that, how do I build that in other folks, right? How do I build other leaders? And that's what the great leaders separates, leaders from great leaders is, I think, in my personal opinion, how are they going to invest in that? And that's a conversation, we're having here in the LI about like, our programming, like how can we shift also or make programming around how to build other leaders, right? Because like, we do a lot of self-leadership, because you have to know yourself first, right? You have to lead yourself first. That's so critical. But what's that next step, right? And again, too, where we talked about, or if we talked about on the show before, a lot of times sometimes people get promoted into leadership roles or positions because they were good at the job. They don't have any leadership training, right? So they aren't effective as a leader, or again, so it's like once, like anything, once you close your mind off to that, or like you're not open to growth or feedback, it's game over, right? It's really quick to lose all that influence with people because, again, people want to, be appreciated, be remembered, especially if they trust you and they've put you into that position to lead them, right? And that's fair, right? They should be able to demand that, and I'm a leader, so I love that. It's so important.
And the feedback piece goes into that too, right? Like positionally, if you're quote unquote at the top of the org chart, right? You want to be receptive to feedback. You want to be talking to the people that your actions influence and not just assuming I've got people for that, right? Or, if they have a problem, they'll come find me. It means so much to be approachable and to solicit and receive feedback. But it can be, I feel like those positions often, because it's like there's one person, right? The CEO is one person. And it is isolating in that sense that you don't have to interact with as many humans as maybe someone in more the entry level. And so you just forget what that experience is like. Which I think, unfortunately, is why sometimes you're just like, why are they making these decisions that are not talking to us, right? And so if we could see more of that, definitely, it would make a huge difference. And I think too, like that can also help maybe eradicate some of like that CEO blindness, right? People just telling you what you want to hear because and that ties them back to that feedback, that culture of feedback or empathy, right? If you have that in there, and vulnerability, then hopefully people are comfortable telling you, when things don't go well and all that kind of stuff. And so, no, that's super critical to make sure that when you're in those roles, or even just along the way, you're continuing to kind of develop as those leadership pieces. I mean, if you get there and you're done, then
what's the
you're
point,
doing
right?
Folks a disservice, right?
Exactly. Like you're there, and a good way too is like if you're in a high role or you're separated from folks that are maybe in the day to day, go spend a day there, right? Like I think it comes down to priorities. And I always when people are like, in these positions, I don't have time. It's an excuse, exactly, right? Especially if you're in a human-focused industry, right? That's the whole job, right? Now, you go from a source of empathy, you're like, I don't know what they're doing, right, all day. It's probably very tough and the challenges they have. But, again, it's all comes down to priorities. And I think, leaders that do that are obviously going to have more influence, but also to stronger connections with the people they're working with. And then, ideally in times of crisis or hard times, you see people weather that because of that, those strong relationships. And you see a lot of other, companies or things kind of, fracture or disappear. I think a lot about, the pandemic.
Yeah.
And, there was so much going on, and there's a lot of different things, but, I'd be curious, and I'm sure there's stuff already, like, to show, those organizations that were able to survive that or weather that, or if you want to go back to the financial crisis of, the late 2000s, like, it was those strong teams. Now, of course, there's some that had a lot of resources that made it, but you saw some huge, corporations, tons of resources just evaporate, right? And I think, that might come down to some of that piece of, like, hey, like, those strong relationships were built, that piece. And so, but that doesn't, again, happen overnight. That's through the day-to-day interactions in the small way. And I think a big piece, too, is, you mentioned, like, if you're in that role or, making sure it's genuine, right? And not just to be like, hey, because people know that. They're going to see through that instantly, and that's not going to help you out as well. So making sure that you genuinely want to understand how someone's doing, or, stuff. And again, that's going to take time and effort, but it's so important, and it's going to pay, and again, don't look at it as of, what am I going to get out of this myself down the line, but more so how you can provide value to others. And I think if you have that framework, it's going to be really helpful. So, but yeah.
The human capital of any organization is the most valuable asset.
Oh, that's such a good way to say that.
When you think about, like, I might be making all this money, or I've got people to connect with that, right? But if you are an organization that minimizes turnover, that people feel connected and they're, engaged in coming to work, right? Not that, people don't have to make work their whole personality or, like, spend 60 million hours a week at work. But I think if you have people who are excited to do the work, that believe in what you're hoping to do, then that matters. But it also starts from someone who is living what they're hoping for from the rest of you. And so there's actually, there's a principal on TikTok right now. I don't know if you've seen this person. He's a principal, and he abandoned his office for, like, a rolling cart. Okay. So he can go around and, like, pop in and talk to people, or if there's, like, a disciplinary challenge, he can, like, be right there and respond and be mobile and not this, like, figure in his office. Yeah. Which I think kind of makes me think of this, because you're out, you're visible, but not from I'm observing you and waiting to see you mess up way. Like, how can I tap in and provide support? Yeah. Which I think is huge. I mean, that's awesome. Just this idea of, like, going to the principal's office feels already like a barrier.
Exactly. Yeah.
But if you have an office where people can come by, or if you're out and you're popping around, then that already has changed the narrative for you.
For sure. That visibility piece is huge. I'm sure the staff really appreciates that as well. And
I think so.
It's like that's pretty sweet. I have not seen them. Check that out though.
It's really cool. I don't know the user, but I was like, that's really interesting, right? Like, leaders trying to be mobile and checking in on people matters. So
absolutely. Again, that's a big piece too, right? The visibility piece. Or are you accessible to people when they need you? Right. If possible, right? Some things, you can't if you're pulled into a specific meeting or something or away, but making sure that you make that time. And again, it takes a lot of work, but super important.
It does take a lot of work.
To be an effective leader. Awesome. What's one area of your personal leadership development you're currently working on right now?
Ooh, that is a good question. So I am, I feel like I'm always working on a lot, because I like to learn and I like to push myself. But something I'm working on right now, I think, is navigating, like, how to manage upwards. And so I think that's a skill that you can have. It's really easy to think about, okay, folks who report to me, maybe there's that trust, that positional, right, conversation. But I think it is a different skill to learn how to influence above, right? And so trying to understand what that looks like in an organization, in my personal life too, right? Like, folks who have power in different ways. And so just trying to understand, right, like, and I'm not necessarily talking about, like, right above me, but when I'm thinking about my work, I'm thinking about what aligns with the larger vision of the institution, and how can I contribute to that, and maybe provide feedback or share things that would help us all improve and get better. Like I said, I've talked about being futuristic, strategic's another one of my strengths. And so I think about, right, how is what I'm doing contributing to the overall mission and vision? And so that is the skill that I'm developing in, I would say. I think it's really hard to think about how your work can be influential and impact those that you report to, either directly or like, you know, indirectly in the tier of things. And so that's something, it can be challenging to say like, hey, let's talk about this, right? Or
For sure, yeah.
Can you help me understand where this is coming from? But practicing that, one, opens you up to being receptive to that from folks that report to you, but two, it can help you kind of understand how to navigate difficult situations or how that unfolds. And so that's something I've been trying to work on in this sort of like middle management role. But it's definitely a challenge. I think I'm also working on my, I always pour into my facilitation skills too.
Yeah.
So I have an upcoming opportunity with LeaderShape where I'm going to be working on their curriculum and learning how to engage the larger group a little bit better. And something I'm thinking about is how to, when folks are disengaged for whatever reason, right? What can we do to bring them back in without them feeling called out and singled out? Because there's doing a lot of learning and understanding around like, you know, right, the deficit-based model I talked about. But thinking about if you call someone out, then there's shame in that, right? And then that might spiral and then that might continue, right? But we want folks to feel engaged and included. And so just like navigating the gray of all of that is another thing I'm working on and thinking about and how I can level up more to engage folks in those spaces.
That's such a interesting thing I think we've been seeing a lot too. I'm thinking about literally like, you know, when we were just, you know, facilitating together, you know, in one of our big programs, we saw some disengagement and, you know, I don't know, it's tough I think sometimes because you're like, well, you obviously want everyone to have a good experience, but also they're going to have to want that experience themselves, right?
Correct.
It's like that old, you know, cliche saying like what you put into is what you're gonna get out of it. 100%. It's always true. But like, how do you motivate people to get there? But at the same time, it's like at a certain point, how do you just maybe like, you know what I mean? Like you can't put too much. I don't know. It's hard, right?
Right. You don't want to push people to their breaking point,
right?
But you want them to feel included.
You want to challenge them, right? But if they also are just disengaged, like. At a certain point, there's a bunch of you that are engaged. Like you might just have, I don't know. It's hard. It's a hard piece of facilitation and leadership. So
trying to figure out, are there other ways we can check in on folks that don't feel as like called out, right? Like, what does that look like? And so trying to understand through like a model of empathy and support and thinking about, if you are experiencing something, I don't necessarily want you to raise your hand in a group of 100 and say, hey, I'm going through this, I need help, right? But how do we create spaces where you can get connected with someone? One-off
conversations or just, that space.
Yeah, how do you indicate like, I'm someone that would love an extra check-in today. So trying to figure that out.
No, for sure. Good luck with that journey.
Yeah,
man.
it's going to be good.
We'll have to have you come back on when you get that figured out and share, you know, with our audience for sure about how that's going. In terms of like I really like, you know, your area of growth in terms of leading kind of up, right? How's that gone? Has there been things that you've kind of noticed or things that have worked that you don't mind sharing with folks, or is it still kind of work in progress?
So I think when I was a new professional and started my career, I think you hear about like, okay, you can manage up, like you can do it, like, you know, you think you have some of those skills, but then the first couple times you get shot down, you're like, okay, maybe not, right? Maybe it's not my time and I don't have this yet. But then sometimes I would like connect with someone on campus and it would be like, oh, okay, so they do, like, I do have these skills, or they are invested in that. And so I think a big piece of that has been finding mentors who can provide some of that clear feedback, but then also help understand if it is situational, maybe the experience I was having, or systemic, or something that I could do differently. And so I think that's been a big piece that's been helpful already. But then I also think, you know, depending on the field that you work in, right, like education is bound by certain limitations always, right? And so we want to change the world, but, you know, we are limited by budget and time and all those things. And so I think sometimes it's about framing my mindset of like, okay, if I can't change your mind, can you at least help me understand why better? Because we are on a team at the end of the day, right? And so that's something I've learned to do more recently, is say, okay, here's my viewpoint. I understand that we can't maybe make those changes because that might be coming from a different directive or whatever, right? How can you help me understand how to explain the why so that I can help be a supportive team member, right? Because we're on the same team. I want to support the team. But it helps me if I can understand the why a little bit better.
Definitely.
Because then I can translate that across. Right. So that's something that I have been working on. It's definitely not easy, especially depending on what your reporting structure looks like and how often you meet with folks. But I've had supervisors currently and in the past who were super approachable and super open if I was like, hey, so I noticed this, right? One of the first times I actually gave critical feedback to a supervisor was in grad school. And so my supervisor at the time, I don't think he would be mad if I told this story, but we had presented together for the first time and had, you know, I felt that, you know, when I shared, he would restate the same thing just in a different way. And so it felt like, I was like, did you not trust what I was saying? You know, where was the confidence? He was like, I didn't even realize I was doing it. I was trying to just like emphasize your thoughts. And I said, well, for me, it felt like, you know, I was not saying the right thing, you know, and I noticed that. And so he was like, oh my God, thank you for telling me. And like, that was a really good feedback opportunity. And so sometimes I remember that, like, okay, people are open to grow. They want to learn. And so, like, being able to do that. But it's not easy to do. And sometimes the easier thing is to say, you know what? I don't make these decisions. I can't change it. So I'm just going to find my corner of peace and I'm going to do that. And sometimes we have to do that to survive, right?
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
I think about COVID times, right? Like, oof, like all those decisions that are something that we didn't even get to, you know, navigate. Right. Here's what's happening in the world. Respond. But I think now that, you know, the world is a little more regulated in that way. It gets easier the more trust and the more connection you have with someone to say, hey, I'm noticing this. Help me understand. But it's definitely tricky to do. I would also say the further removed they are from your direct day-to-day is the harder that it gets too. So.
Definitely. If they're not seeing, and like that's a skill in itself, right? That art to communicate that. But I also think too, and I really appreciate you sharing that experience, but also too, like what you've learned on that journey as well, as like I think it goes back to what we talked about today. You know, if there's more trust, more empathy present, it's easier usually to do that. And it's also okay, like, to push your ideas a little bit, right? Like, you know, I think we see a lot of time we get told no and it's over, right? And I know, like, that's something that, like, I don't know if it's a little bit more prevalent and again, this is just from experience of who I'm working with. I don't know some different populations, but young adults, like, you know, it's like the path of least resistance sometimes. Like, just because you get the answer you're maybe not looking for, like a maybe, I see a lot of people just kind of like, well, you know, screw it, or just kind of shut down. Right. But in reality, like if you maybe would have pushed again at a different time or with someone else, maybe that's an opportunity for you, but also like whether to make your, you know, your ideas come true, your dreams, or just also like try new things. And I think sometimes it's okay to ask for an explanation. Now, there's again a balance. Don't be too hard on that, right? And sometimes you just have to take no, and sometimes you're not going to know everything, right? There's things that maybe, you know, people of you just can't tell you, right? For so many different reasons, right? Or it's not ready to tell you. And so coming out of that respect and that mindset too, but I think it's okay to check in, and again, it's all the way of how you approach it, right? Try not to come from a frustration standpoint possible, like, and like, hey, like, kind of felt shut down here. Is there a way we could explore this as an alternate way? Maybe not right now, but in the future, is there alternate things or supplemental things you need from me to make it possible, right? To show that maybe, like, I've thought about this deeper than maybe I projected it as well, right? Especially when you're making a pitch, it can be kind of, you know, you've maybe thought about it a lot, but maybe leave out some key things. I think asking for that is totally appropriate and necessary at times. And so just making sure, like, if you're listening, like, and that's difficult, I think it's difficult for everyone in some way. Ask for it, right? You just never know. Or if you haven't asked at all yet, try it, right? What's the worst that can happen, right? It's a no now, maybe a yes later, or you find someone else who's going to jump in on that, right?
Exactly.
So,
and I do think there's a bit of like political savvy needed to navigate those conversations, and I feel like I have learned that over the years. And if you know the folks that you're working with and you know your team, you can know when, this person, there's a lot going on, or they're having a day, or this is not the time to now come and be like, do you have time for me to pitch my idea to you? Because the likeliness that they're going to hear you and actually be able to give their attention to you is not great, right? And so I think that comes with like trust building and understanding people around you, because if you walk in day one, you're like, I read all my materials for my onboarding, or I just joined this organization, I have 20 ideas for how we're going to make it better. They're going to look at you like, who are you? You haven't
rookie,
like,
right?
Connected, right? And so it's not to say that folks who are joining an organization or a job like can't have new ideas. We want that. We want to cultivate that. And sometimes there's a little bit of like, you don't know that maybe, I think about COVID times, right? Like if one of my staff had pitched to me a great new program idea on the day that I found out I was living in the South at the time, like on the day I found out that we were closing the halls and sending folks home for this semester, I would have been like, I don't even know if I can listen to this pitch right now, right? And so when you think about like the savviness of timing,
Yeah.
I think is essential too. Like if you are tuned into someone's body language or the words that they're using, maybe you can be like, hey, you know what, maybe this seems like not the best time to have this conversation. When could we maybe loop back to this, or would you prefer I email you something? Like, what would be better? It's important to me, but I think maybe my timing might be off.
Right. So. And I think even like showing that, people really appreciate that as well, you realizing that, and they also might be more apt to hear you, you know what I mean, on your ideas. And again, too, that's, talking, sharing those things and the political savviness. And that also, like, sometimes you do need to wait, but also don't take that to the extreme of, like, I have to wait for the perfect time, because that's never going to happen either, right?
Yes.
It's going to find that balance of, like, okay, do I just ask whenever, or do I never, or wait for the perfect time? It's like, neither usually works out well. Find somewhere in the middle, I think, can help. And and you're going to make mistakes along the way, right? People are going to, that's something like a learned ability, like you said. It's a skill. Right. So I think just being comfortable in doing that. And then typically, at least speaking from, our experience here, if you're a student at CMU, or you're looking to be, or whatever, like, I think not everybody, but I think a lot of people here really genuinely want to help. Or again, maybe they're not the person that can connect you with that next person who can be. And so that's very helpful too. So
like if you ask me to do something during the week of move-in, I'm so excited to hear about this, and I need to schedule you for after Labor Day, right? At that point, realistically. And 100%. So it's also okay if you're on the receiving end of that to say, hey, my capacity right now is not where I want it to be. And that's okay. Like, I love to hear this, but I need to be able to have that capacity. And I also think that's an important self-reflection piece. You have to know yourself well enough to say, is this last meeting, or is adding another meeting to my day going to push me over? Right. And so knowing, and also creating that culture in your group, organization, RSO, whatever, where it's okay to say, hey, I need a pause. And then can we loop back to this? Or let's talk next week when I've gotten through X, Y, and Z things.
Absolutely. So, sweet. Okay. So we have, I guess, real quick, actually, is there anything that we didn't talk about today that you want to share? Any questions we didn't ask that you're just like, man, I really wanted to talk about this?
I think lots of really great questions. I think if I had to end with another thought related to empathy, I just would say be kind to yourself. I mean, you're listening to this and you're like, wow, this is a great checklist. I'm going to start all of these things right now. And that's a phenomenal idea, but we should never strive for perfection, because that's a impossible thing to strive for. We should strive for growing and being a little bit better every day, and trying to be the best human that we can be, being open to feedback and all of that good stuff. But I just think show yourself some kindness. It's definitely the hardest thing to learn at times, but it's the most important thing to learn.
That's all. Love that. So we have a special tradition on this show, so where our last guest actually leaves our next guest a question, not knowing who it's going to be, and our audience is who's going to answer it. So the question left for you is, and then obviously you'll have to ask one as well, is what's a situation where your approach to leadership or leadership philosophy got called into question and you had to adapt your approach? What happened?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the way it felt most salient to me is when I transitioned from supervising undergraduate students to the role that I have now, where I actually don't supervise anybody. And so moving from a direct supervision, positional leadership role to more of a consulting, project oversight, but still needing to mentor, guide, facilitate, support folks. That was definitely an adjustment, because you're used to a routine, and I was used to, okay, I've got folks I need to check in on consistently. I've got a team, and then my team became much more undefined and broad in that context. And so I think trying to understand, okay, I still want to center humans. I still want to center people. And for me, that led to going out and creating opportunities to get some of that feedback. So I adapted and went to every single staff meeting for the parapros to ask them feedback about the curriculum, because I'm like, this is not an engagement I'm having in the day-to-day where I'm a hall director and I can say, hey, how are you feeling about this, right? I want to hear it from you. Did that take a lot of time and investment? Yeah, but it mattered to me. And so trying to have more opportunities like that, like, hey, I've open office hours this day, come see me, and trying to create that openness. But for me, that means in August when I have training with the staff, I have to come in hard with my like approach to being open, vulnerable, aware of their experience, knowing that I'm not someone that in the organization they're going to see every day, right? When you have a staff, you're going to see them probably every day, maybe for the most part, right? When you're at work, when you're a hall director, you live in a building, right? Your students are all alongside you. Folks may not see me every day. They might not even see me once a week, depending on where they're located. So encouraging that as an opportunity. And also sometimes it's helped me to be a little bit funny. So I, at training, harp on them so hard to drink water. And so now there's that connection piece, like, oh, Audrey, she's the one that tells us to drink water. And so it is a little bit of a joke. It's very important to do. So if any of you are listening, make sure you drink your water. But I think you just I had to completely adapt my approach. Because it just changed my routine to engage with the students. Because it would be very easy for me to sit in my office all the time and just get my work done and go to the required meetings I have. But I love getting to see the students, but you have to be much more intentional when you transition in that. So that, I think, my first year I was like, wow, they're not just going to come to me. I gotta go to them, right? And so thinking about how to show up and be connected and in those spaces was really important.
So important. Well, especially too, like, working in the industry too, like, it's about the student's experience, right? So it's so imperative to do that. And you've been working on a big curriculum change, which I'm excited to see how it goes. It looks really cool. So, if you're going to be at CMU and living in the residential halls, you're going to get to see that hopefully soon. So,
this August, it's launching.
Did all the legwork to make sure you got great feedback and ideas from people, different stakeholders at our institution. So, excellent answer. Okay. Here's one big question. What are you going to ask our next guest? So it can be anything we talked about today, leadership, anything you want to know.
Yeah, I think I'm curious as to what their biggest challenge with conveying empathy in their own work has been. Okay. So when they think about, what has your roadblock been? Okay. Brene Brown also talks about this concept of like a shield that everybody has. So what's your shield and what has kept you from showing up and being empathetic in the past? And how did you overcome it?
Love that.
Or is it still a shield?
Yeah, still a shield and just looking to improve it. Great question. To tune in, you don't have to hear the answer and who's going to answer that next. You have to tune into our next episode. Audrey, thank you so much. It's been great learning about all these insightful things you've shared about empathy, supervision, feedback, leadership, all that good stuff. Where can people find you if you want to share that? And then we can drop it in the description.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much for having me. This has been really fun. So my office is in the South Success Center. So if you head to Merrill Dining, which is a great place to go grab some lunch or some dinner, and you are on the Merrill side, you can head in the Success Center. My office is in there. I'm happy to connect with anyone further about this, but maybe we can leave my email in the comments too, and folks can connect with me that way. I love to talk with students especially about stuff like this, right? It's a huge part of why I'm in this field. So I would love to see you.
Audrey, again, thank you so much. Such a good episode. Any last closing thoughts?
I think just every day try to just be a little bit better.
Awesome.
That's what I can hope for you.
Love it. Such a good way to close it out. For now, keep leading the way. Tune in next time. Thanks for tuning in today. We'll see you. Peace.